The Health Rangers' denouncement of MAHA's alliance with Zionism. Health freedom advocates are faced with the choice this election of whether they believe that all children's lives matter or not. By Jeremy R. Hammond. I'm sure that most of my readers are familiar with Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, who publishes Natural News and founded the video hosting website Brighteon. A few days ago, he published a video titled "The Podcast That May End My Career." Mike Adams calls out Zionist infiltration of MAGA and MAHA. In it, he provides an inspired commentary about how the health freedom movement has been led astray by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again, MAHA movement, which has allied with Donald Trump's Make America Great Again, MAGA movement, and aims to get Donald Trump elected. Mike's comments resonate greatly with my own views about this, so I highly encourage you to listen to what he has to say. The focal point of Mike's criticism is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s and Donald Trump's support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. The title of Mike's commentary indicates his awareness that by delivering this message, he is going to upset a lot of people. This, too, resonates deeply with me. I know from experience that, by publishing this article, I am likely to anger and lose readers. But my conscience compels me to speak out and state my view honestly. I usually do not participate in the whole election charade because, in my view, the act of voting serves to legitimize the criminal organization in Washington, D.C. The only time it is worth voting is when there is an extraordinary candidate who represents a true anti-establishment position, someone with honesty and integrity who would act to end the regime's lawlessness and try to restore a constitutional government. Hence, the only candidate I have ever voted for was Dr. Ron Paul, whom I checked off on my ballot in 2008 and wrote in 2012. We are indoctrinated since early childhood into what I call the state religion, including the belief that we have a moral and patriotic duty to participate in presidential elections. But as Brittany Schaffer and I explained a few months ago, the argument can easily be made that the most socially responsible thing you can do is not vote. Voting for the lesser of evils is still voting for evil. And why vote for evil? Why tacitly concede that the system is legitimate when it is not? Why tacitly consent to the perpetuation of the status quo? Why act to legitimize the criminal organization in Washington? This is not wisdom. Voting for the lesser of evils has never worked before as a strategy. All it has ever done is to bring us to where we are today, facing yet another supposed choice between two evils. Enough. To date, despite all the pushback I have received about the question of who to vote for and whether to vote, nobody has presented me with any valid counter-argument to the position Brittany and I elucidated. Instead, people present me with the following reasons why I should vote for Trump. If I don't vote, I'll be sending the message to Washington that I am just apathetic. It is unreasonable for me to expect a perfect candidate, and I need to be more pragmatic and accept the reality of the situation. If I don't vote against Kamala Harris and she wins the election, I will be responsible for that outcome. We must prevent Harris from winning at all costs. If Trump wins, he'll put RFK Jr. into a position of power, and he'll make America healthy again. But none of these is a valid counter-argument to my position. Each one is rather a repetition of the same logical fallacies that Brittany and I already addressed. It matters that my act of not voting is not due to any kind of apathy on my part, but is instead a manifestation of my interest and concern in the current state of affairs and the future direction of our society. If we ever hope to see any kind of real change, we need to stop legitimizing a system that has no legitimacy. I have never suggested that we should only ever vote if there is a perfect candidate. This is a disingenuous straw man fallacy. It is not I and others who refuse to participate who will be responsible for the outcome of this election. Rather, it is everyone who votes who will be responsible for the outcome. If you vote for Trump and Harris still wins, you will be the one who has acted to legitimize that outcome. And if Trump wins, well, you'll have acted to legitimize all his horribleness too. The blood will be on your hands, not mine. And it doesn't matter what the cost is of defeating Harris. It is worth selling our souls to keep her out of the White House? It is worth it to send the message to Washington that its support for Israel's genocide in Gaza is a matter of no consideration? That dead Palestinian children are an acceptable sacrifice as long as we don't end up with Biden 2.0 or Obama 3.0? That the mass murder of innocent Palestinian children is a matter of such little practical significance that we can just overlook it and vote for Trump, even though he, like Biden and Harris and Kennedy, has expressed nothing but support for this crime against humanity? I, for one, join Mike Adams in saying no, I will not compromise my moral values that way. I will not sell my soul. You can't defeat evil by making deals with the devil. As for the belief that Trump will empower RFK Jr. to make America healthy again, why should I believe that? Why should I base my decision to vote strictly on a matter of faith? What has Trump ever done to earn my trust? He did everything possible to unearn it during his whole first term in office. Trump campaigned on a promise to drain the swamp in Washington, but once in power did the opposite. A generous interpretation is that the deep state bent Trump to its will, although that explanation hardly explains his apparent eagerness in serving its malevolent agenda. Trump basically pursued a neocon foreign policy, including increasing military spending, continuing U.S. support for Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza, illegally moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, ending the nuclear deal with Iran and re-implementing crippling sanctions, despite Iran's honoring of the agreement, assassinating the Iranian Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, despite his instrumental role in fighting the Islamic State terrorist organization, which the U.S. had allied itself with and armed in Syria, illegally bombing Syria by his own admission, betraying his promise to work toward friendly relations with Russia, which might have avoided provoking Russia into war with Ukraine, and working to dismantle the nuclear arms control framework agreements with Russia. Domestically, Trump kept people like Dr. Anthony Fauci in positions of authority within the so-called public health establishment, and put Fauci et al. In charge of overseeing the implementation of the authoritarian lockdown regime, the endgame of which was always coerced mass vaccination. Trump remains proud of having overseen Operation Warp Speed, which resulted in experimental mRNA vaccines developed using gene therapy technology being forced upon the population on the basis of lies and the threat of continued lockdowns, resulting in the systematic violation of individuals' right to informed consent. He oversaw the consequent economic destruction and monetization of dramatically increased government debt via the creation of trillions of new dollars out of thin air by the Federal Reserve, causing the extraordinarily harmful price inflation Americans have been struggling with. So why should I place my faith in Donald Trump? Why should I believe that he will put RFK Jr. into a position to end the policies causing so much harm to Americans' health? And even if I were to believe that, how exactly would that work? Does RFK Jr. advocate what really needs to be done, which is for the government to get completely out of the business of our health and to eliminate agencies like the CDC and FDA that exist to serve the pharmaceutical industry at the expense of public health? No. He wants to reform these agencies. But they aren't broken. They are working exactly according to design. The corruption isn't a bug, it's a feature, as Brittany and I also explained in our discussion about why not voting is a socially responsible choice. And, of course, even if I believed that Trump would put RFK Jr. in a position to do something about the government's central role in the destruction of Americans' health, and even if I believed that RFK Jr. had a feasible plan to do that, there is still the matter of his support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. I refuse to send the message through my action of voting that both Trump's and Kennedy's shared extreme Zionist ideology and advocacy of the mass murder of Palestinian children is something I am willing to just overlook. It is not within my being to make that choice. I will not do it. I cannot. When RFK Jr. first announced his candidacy for president, I was torn. I had to contemplate deeply whether I would support him or nobody. He is no Ron Paul when it comes to his views on economics, for example. I like that he often says that he believes in the free market. But that is difficult to take seriously when he contradicts himself by also advocating harmful interventionist policies, like his insane idea of addressing the housing affordability crisis by incentivizing people to buy a home by having the government co-sign their mortgages, thus increasing demand at a time when housing prices are already so far out of reach, while also essentially promising a taxpayer bailout on the resulting defaulted loans. And how would that be paid for? You've guessed it, more dollar devaluation via legalized counterfeiting, which is to say, more fraud. Did Kennedy learn nothing from the 2000s housing bubble? About which I wrote a short book titled Ron Paul versus Paul Krugman, which Barron's described as a must-read that, quote, conveys more insight into the causes and cures of business cycles than most textbooks, end quote. Like I said, RFK Jr. is no Ron Paul. If I ever heard him call to end the Fed, he might sell me on his economic views, but until then, the conclusion is inescapable that he doesn't really believe in a free market economy. Still, I was willing to overlook that. After all, he did oppose the move toward a central bank digital currency, CBDC, and recognized the need for currency decentralization, so even if he wasn't calling for an end to central banking, at least he was on the right track and might eventually arrive at the correct conclusion. Like I said, the argument that we can't expect a perfect candidate is a straw man fallacy, because it's not my view that we must be in total agreement about every issue with the candidate to be able to vote for them. Another consideration that ran through my mind was his position on climate change. I couldn't quite understand how he can see so clearly how political and financial agendas thoroughly corrupt the science on vaccines, yet not see how the same holds true for the climate issue. I was pleased, though, to see him at one point speaking out against how climate change was being utilized to drive the agenda of global authoritarian governance. So I was willing to overlook our differing points of view on that matter too, and so on. Setting aside our differing viewpoints on other issues, I considered Bobby Kennedy's leadership in the health freedom movement to have been absolutely heroic. And his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which references two of my own articles, contained the most concise and scathing indictment of the authoritarian lockdowns that I had ever read. Moreover, I had come to consider Bobby Kennedy as a friend. While I've never met him in person, we have communicated on many occasions, including several times in which he called me on the phone. He interviewed me twice on his podcast, once to discuss the anti-science nature of the authoritarian lockdowns, and a second time to discuss the government's systematic violation of the right to informed consent. I had collaborated with his organization, Children's Health Defense, and written numerous articles for them, as well as a freely downloadable ebook, about how, under the government's censorship regime, the mere act of advocating the right to informed consent was being ludicrously defined as spreading misinformation about vaccines. And that was pre-COVID. At one point, believe it or not, I was even accused by one lunatic conspiracy theorist of collaborating with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as agents of Big Pharma to push the pharmaceutical industry's agenda. Bobby had publicly praised me as a source of reliable information. He had said, I really rely on his judgment a lot, on a lot of issues that are very complex. He had described me as an amazing reporter, an amazing writer. It was Bobby who was responsible for my book, The War on Informed Consent, being published, for which he wrote a foreword, as well as a blurb describing me as a brilliant and accomplished journalist. I had come to greatly admire Bobby Kennedy as a man of honor and integrity. He had shown me incredible respect and support, and he had earned mine. Ultimately, after very carefully considering the matter, I decided that RFK Jr. was sufficiently anti-establishment for me to support his candidacy for president. I emailed him to let him know my decision, pointing out that he was only the second candidate in my lifetime who I considered worthy of my vote. Following that, and not only to express my support for his candidacy, but also just because it was otherwise warranted, I wrote numerous articles debunking the mainstream media's deceitful attacks on him, and correcting the government-approved disinformation about vaccines, including the following. Daily Beast hit piece on RFK Jr. Can't get basic facts straight, April 13th, 2023. ABC News hit piece on RFK Jr. illuminates the vaccine religion, April 14th, 2023. The mainstream media's reign of error, correcting the record about RFK Jr.'s deadly immunity, June 28th, 2023. Top researcher into non-specific effects of vaccines. RFK Jr. is right about DTP vaccine. July 20th, 2023. Setting the record straight on the denial of Secret Service protection to RFK Jr. August 7, 2023. Why do some of RFK Jr.'s own family members believe the media's lies about him? August 18, 2023. Additionally, in May 2023, I published a freely downloadable ebook thoroughly debunking a New York Times hit piece on RFK Jr. and demonstrating incontrovertibly that the only vaccine misinformation being spread in this instance was from the Times. After my piece exposing the mainstream media's misinformation about the Biden administration's denial of Secret Service protection, Kennedy went on Tucker Carlson's show and mentioned my name while referencing my article. It was around June of 2023 that it first came to my attention that Bobby was misinformed about the nature of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which frankly surprised me because he seemed to have such sensible and knowledgeable views on other matters of foreign policy, such as the war in Ukraine. On Twitter, he had retweeted a post from the legendary Roger Waters, the former band member of Pink Floyd, in which, if memory serves, Waters had rightly criticized the U.S. government's role in provoking Russia to invade Ukraine, a topic on which Kennedy has also been really great. But then Kennedy deleted his retweet and told the media that his reason for doing so was that he hadn't realized Waters was such an anti-Semite. I was startled to see Bobby accepting that malicious accusation against Rogers, since it fallaciously equates the musician's rightful anti-Zionism in opposition to Israel's crimes against the Palestinians with hatred for Jews. Discomforted by Kennedy's propagation of the Zionist ad hominem argument that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, I sent Bobby a copy of my book, Obstacle to Peace: The U.S. Role in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which has a foreword by former UN Special Rapporteur Richard Falk and an introduction by economist and former Barron's editor Gene Epstein, both of whom are Jewish. In fact, Mr. Epstein wrote his introduction specifically to preempt any accusation of anti-Semitism against me. Scott Horton, the popular radio show host and director of the Libertarian Institute, where I have since March been honored as a research fellow, recently described Obstacle to Peace as the definitive scholarly account of the American role in the entire disaster. Kennedy acknowledged receipt of the book in the mail, and I had hoped that it would influence his thinking on the matter, but, alas, every new comment I saw him making about the topic after that was more extremely Zionist in character than the one before. Then the Hamas-led terrorist attacks of October 7th occurred, followed by Israel's retaliatory Operation Swords of Iron, which was characterized by indiscriminate attacks on civilians and systematic destruction of the civilian infrastructure. Kennedy, of course, rightly condemned the murder of Israeli civilians by Hamas militants, but I was very concerned to see him expressing his support for Israel's brazen war crimes and repetition of tired Zionist propaganda talking points that bear no relationship to the historical documentary record or to the observable reality on the ground in Gaza. I then had to contend with my conscience. How could I continue to support the candidacy of someone defending Israel's brazen war crimes in Gaza? I struggled with that question for weeks, waiting, hoping that he would come to his senses and recognize the truth about what was happening. I hoped that, given the renewed focus of the Israel-Palestine conflict in global news headlines, he would make the time to read my book. In a couple of mutual networks within the health freedom community, I was speaking out against Israel's war crimes, for which I was, of course, stupidly accused by some as an anti-Semite. But I stood my ground, and not one of my critics ever managed to identify even a single factual or logical error in anything I had to say about the topic. I kept at it largely because I maintained the vain hope that my outspokenness might influence Kennedy, help him to see the truth, and prompt him to also start speaking out against the ongoing massacre of Palestinian civilians. I knew he was receiving my messages because in March of this year I published an article demonstrating how the BBC had hypocritically accused RFK Jr. of spreading vaccine misinformation on the basis of its own brazen deceptions. After I shared it to my networks, Mr. Kennedy replied to thank me for it. I could not understand why he was so dismissive of everything I had to say about the Palestine conflict, as reflected in his public comments about the topic. The more he said about it, the more alarmed I was to see him so deeply indoctrinated into Zionist ideology and so impervious to facts and reason. Finally, after over a month of struggling with my conscience and hoping vainly to get through to him, I sent a newsletter to my subscribers notifying them that I was withdrawing my support for RFK Jr.'s candidacy because of his support for Israel's war crimes in Gaza. About a week later, I decided that it was important not to keep that message exclusive to my subscribers, so I made it public. I was virtually alone in the health freedom community for my stance. The only other person in the movement who, to my knowledge, took a courageous public position on it was Sayer G., the founder of Green Med Info, who, as I subsequently learned, had published an article announcing his withdrawal of support for RFK Jr. Very same day, I had sent that newsletter to my subscribers, doing the same. By the time I published my withdrawal of support for RFK Jr.'s candidacy, I had become convinced that Israel was perpetrating not merely war crimes in Gaza, but the crime of genocide, as I publicly stated on November 16th. But I was horrified by the pushback and outright condemnation I received within the health freedom community, where there was what I came to perceive as an almost cult-like devotion to Kennedy. That pushback within the movement for simply taking a principled stand against the crime of genocide prompted me in December to publish an article titled, "Yes, Palestinian Civilians Are Being Massacred," which was a direct response to the pushback I was facing within the health freedom community for speaking out. That earned me more denouncements from individuals incapable of identifying even a single factual or logical error in anything I had to say about the matter, and refusing to back down from my principled stand. I later that month also published an article titled, "Correcting RFK Jr. on Israel's Policies Toward Gaza," once again as a direct response to finding myself almost entirely alone within our mutual networks in speaking out against Israel's genocide and Kennedy's support for it. Meanwhile, within the libertarian community, there was also something of a debate going on, but here I seemed to be succeeding in my efforts to push back against the position that Israel's indiscriminate slaughter of Palestinian civilians was somehow justified. In October, I debated the issue on The Tom Woods Show, arguing the negative to the debate resolution that Israel is justified in doing whatever it takes to completely destroy Hamas in Gaza, which position was defended by Alan Futterman, who had co-authored a Wall Street Journal article with prominent self-described libertarian Walter Block. In February 2024, I wrote an article with Scott Horton, published by the Mises Institute, denouncing Block's position as fundamentally incompatible with the libertarian principle of non-aggression. On February 26th, I was in New York at the Soho Forum to debate the root cause of the conflict with journalist Eli Lake, who argued in favor of the resolution that the root cause is the Palestinians' rejection of Israel's right to exist, whereas I argued that there is no such thing as a state's right to exist, which is a propaganda talking point designed to obfuscate the true cause, which is the Zionists' rejection of Palestinian self-determination and Israel's systematic violation of Palestinians' fundamental human rights, including what the International Court of Justice, ICJ, had 1 month prior, on January 26th, determined to be a plausible genocide. In March, I was honored with the position of research fellow at the Libertarian Institute, where my debut article detailed the Biden administration's complicity in Israel's genocide. And last month, I wrote a detailed and definitive rebuttal to Walter Block's ludicrous position that the proper libertarian position is to support Israel's crimes against humanity, titled, "Walter Block is a Zionist extremist, not a libertarian." I have many readers, friends, and colleagues within the health freedom movement who expect me to shut up and get on board with supporting RFK Jr., which now has transformed into supporting Donald Trump. "A vote for Trump is a vote for Kennedy," a banner declared recently on the website mahanow.org, which is where users are now redirected if they try to access teamkennedy.com, the website of RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign prior to his dropping out of the race and endorsing Trump. Never mind how Kennedy had responded to speculation back in May 2023 that he might drop out and join Trump by saying that he would under no circumstances do so, because their positions on fundamental issues, approaches to governance, and philosophies of leadership could not be further apart. That was the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I wanted to support. Never mind how Kennedy this past April appropriately criticized Trump for having betrayed the hopes of his most sincere followers, including perpetuating the Ukraine war instead of working to end it, serving the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry, overseeing the criminal shutdown of the economy, dramatically increasing the federal debt, filling his administration with swamp creatures instead of draining the swamp, and torpedoing the U.S. Constitution. That was the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I wanted to support. Instead, we now see Kennedy cynically proclaiming that, quote, "The Republican Party has become the party of the common man, of working people, of the middle class," end quote. Which is just as delusional as his concurrently made claim that this used to be the role of the Democratic Party. Barf. Since I publicly withdrew my support for Kennedy, some prominent individuals within the health freedom community tried to persuade me to cease my criticisms by suggesting that I was being utterly naive because, as I was told, he is just doing what he needs to do to get into power. And truly, it was utterly naive of me to believe for a time that Kennedy was worth voting for precisely because he wouldn't play that game. That he would instead stick to being honest with the American people. That he would be different from all the unscrupulous politicians. That he would win by being different or not at all. But it was no less naive of the people who said things like that to me to think that I would see Kennedy just doing what he needs to do to get into power as a reason to support him, rather than a clear vindication of my decision to withdraw my support. Which brings me back to Mike Adams' inspired denouncement of the MAHA movement for its followers' willingness to overlook Israel's genocide in Gaza. If we stay silent on this issue, Mike says, that is the defining failure of our lives. Speaking of RFK Jr., he says, it is a defining moral failure. I could not agree more. It grieves me to no end to see my friend Robert F. Kennedy Jr. destroying his legacy as a defender of children and human rights with his persistent attempts to justify the genocide of Palestinian children. No one can say that they did not know, Mike says. No one can say that we were not aware that this genocide was taking place. Indeed, that was the very point I made in my October 23rd article, Israeli War Crimes Documented by the Israeli Defense Forces, which I concluded with the remark, all one needs to do to see the truth that Israel has been perpetrating the crime of genocide with the full backing of the U.S. government is to open one's eyes. Mike, who is a Christian, also addresses the problem of Christian Zionism, saying that it is not logically possible for one to support the Zionist suppression of Palestinians' human rights and to be a disciple of Jesus the Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach in Hebrew. He notes how the accusation of anti-Semitism is absurdly leveled at anyone who speaks out in support of Palestinians' human rights, and even at people who say that Jews were responsible for Jesus' death, despite the fact that, according to the New Testament itself, the Jewish religious leadership was absolutely complicit in having him crucified. As Mike also rightly notes, adherence to the political ideology of Zionism and defense of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, by which the Jewish state of Israel came into existence, is also incompatible with biblical teachings. He alluded to how Christian Zionists claim that God gave the land to the Jews, but this completely overlooks the central theme of the Old Testament, that the Israelites violated that covenant in all their generations, despite God's repeated warnings that if they persisted in their sinful ways, he would issue them a certificate of divorce, and the land would vomit them out. Christian Zionists also invariably defend Israel's systematic violation of Palestinians' human rights and delude themselves into believing hoax Zionist narratives about the conflict, such as that Israel has the most moral army in the world, or that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. Here are additional remarks that Mike Adams made in his commentary that eloquently express my own viewpoint. Quote, if you can't defend the lives of children in Palestine, then you're not qualified to fight for the lives of children anywhere, because all children's lives matter. There is no child in one place that is more valuable than another child in another place. Every child is a divine creation. Every child is a miracle. Every child has a life worth defending. If you throw some away because you need money for politics in America, then you've abandoned what you claim to believe in. That abandonment has already happened in the MAHA movement. This is the defining moment of our lives. This chapter of your life, there is no undo. The MAHA movement will go down in history as being complicit in the genocide of children. The world is changing rapidly, and those who do not recognize this, and especially those who continue to side with Zionism and genocide against women and children, these people are going to find themselves shocked by the speed and pace of change, the whiplash that will happen geopolitically, economically, and also morally around our world, because the world is done with the terrorism of the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime. The world is done with it. America is finished. Israel is finished. The philosophy of Zionism, apartheid in the Middle East, it's done. You want to be on the right side of history? Denounce genocide. Denounce money printing. Denounce the terror empires of the United States and Israel and join humanity. Make America great again will fail because America will fail. Make America healthy again will fail because they compromised with evil. If you don't realize this, you're living in the past." End quote. I understand that many of my American readers, probably most, are also struggling with the decision of what to do come Election Day next week. I understand that my viewpoint seems alien to many, heretical, perhaps offensive, but it is not my intention to offend anyone who holds a different viewpoint. I am just expressing my own perspective honestly, for the sake of my conscience, and I only ask, dear reader, that you contemplate what I have said and take it into consideration when you make your choice. I fear that by speaking my mind honestly, I may have lost a great friend, and I have lost all hope that Mr. Kennedy might come around and salvage his legacy by speaking out against Israel's genocide, which pains me deeply. I certainly understand why people oppose Kamala Harris, but it also pains me to see the health freedom movement, which had achieved such a great awakening to the reality that the government cannot be trusted to interfere in our health choices, now being misguided into aligning itself with the Republican Party and the proud overseer of Operation Warp Speed. This is what Bobby stood against when he announced his presidential candidacy. The conclusion is inescapable that he has compromised his beliefs and principles out of a thirst for political power, and he is leading the health freedom movement astray by now aligning himself with the political establishment, with the two-headed beast that will continue to devour us and destroy nations regardless of the election outcome, instead of opposing it. He is simply no longer representative of an anti-establishment position, which was the whole reason I initially considered him a rare candidate worth voting for. I said at the start of this article that I know from experience that by publishing this, I am likely to upset and lose readers. I understand why Mike Adams suggests in the title of his commentary that expressing his honest viewpoint about the MAHA movement might be a bad career choice. In fact, while I had never before experienced any significant shrinkage of my mailing list, since last year when I turned the focus of my work back to the Palestine conflict and announced my withdrawal of support for Bobby Kennedy's candidacy, I have lost thousands of subscribers, including former donors. Although it subsided after several months, I also received a flood of hate mail for stating my position, including the usual stupid accusation that my opposition to the crime of genocide is somehow anti-Semitic, an ad hominem attack that is the height of intellectual dishonesty and moral cowardice. As a consequence of my speaking out, I have seen a 24% decrease in donation income so far this year compared to the same period of 2023, which is the main source of revenue that I depend on to cover my business expenses and provide for my family. I did not choose an easy path in life. If I had set out to make a lot of money, I certainly would not have chosen to try to make a living as an independent journalist. But money is not what's most important to me. I have dedicated my life to doing what I can with the skills and knowledge I have acquired, and with the meager resources available to me, to fight for peace and freedom. Especially since becoming a father myself, my motivation has been to help make the world a better place for our children and future generations of humanity. And it is that same motivation that has compelled me to second Mike Adams' denouncement of the MAHA movement's alliance with political Zionism. So, if my comments resonate with you, or if you still disagree with me, but at least respect me for speaking my mind honestly and providing an alternative perspective for consideration, then please consider supporting my work by making a one-time, or better yet, recurring donation. Thank you.